Hi, I'm Liz Basnett. I'm the director of the Emergency Medical Services Authority here in California.
And I'm Tanir. I'm the CEO of the CareStar Foundation, also based in California.
We're excited about our future partnership together. So just thank you for taking the time to be here today to talk about it. I think this is a conversation that I know has been happening for a long time, but it's exciting to really bring it to the front and spotlight it and really kind of give it the attention it deserves. So just a huge thank you for being here today.
Absolutely.
I think, we at EMSA, we have lots of thoughts about maybe what equity is or isn't, or, how to think through policies or informed policy making, or even just procedures and how things are done at the local level. But would love to know more really about the CareStar Foundation, kind of maybe a little bit of the history and what you're looking to do, kind of just thinking through the future of equity in EMS.
Yeah, we got started as a foundation about 7 years ago now, and the idea of really centering equity in our work didn't emerge immediately. It definitely transformed and continues to transform over time. What we mean by equity and how we want to pursue it in some ways is a moving target, but we also have some basic principles and definitions and ways we think about it that are and remain unchanging. So we are constantly in learning mode and pushing ourselves to understand really specifically what does it mean when we say that we use an equity lens to do our work in EMS transformational funding. We do come to the work with an awareness that in spite of our best intentions and having policies, practices, and procedures in place, not all people actually experience the same level of health or benefit of systems at times. And so we, at the CareStar Foundation, we do understand that, and we want to be asking ourselves, what kind of changes can we make to the system that do focus on equitable outcomes? So it's fundamentally different than how do we treat all people the same, but much more focused on how are we looking at ensuring, in our case, because we're a health organization and we're focused on health, how can we help support every person who lives in California achieve an outcome that is equal to their neighbor of a different race or ethnicity or ability. That is what's remained unchanged. And who we partner with and how we manifest it and the types of work that we're doing, that evolves. But that fundamental principle of, are we looking at equitable health outcomes for everyone in the state of California, has always been what we've focused on.
Do you see this work really being mostly focused in the EMS system, or do you guys really look at the broader healthcare continuum in your work?
That's a really great question. And, we're not a huge foundation. And, we became a foundation as a result of the sale of the CareStar air ambulance company to Reach. And so we feel a particular obligation to stay very, very focused in that sort of pre-hospital care, transport, EMS, first response part of the healthcare spectrum. We know and appreciate that systemic inequities go way beyond EMS. We're just getting a snapshot there. We do appreciate that, and we appreciate that partnerships are required to really address it. But we're pretty focused on pre-hospital care and EMS and just kind of what's happening in that universe in which you and I both operate. And I'm curious, now that I've shared some of our sort of origins around equity, I am really curious about your leadership, and EMSA in particular. How did you all begin your journey to focus on equity? And I know you have a special focus on data in particular. So tell me a little bit about the origin story there.
Yeah, so I think it's also a big question, but I think I have been so fortunate. We, as you know, kicked off a strategic planning process when I first kind of came into the world here at EMSA, and really so much of what I heard from the partners that we engaged statewide throughout this multi-month planning process was they wanted guiding principles around equity and around transparency. And, they wanted to make sure that we saw objectives for the next 10 years in the EMS system that highlight key equity work. And this was something, obviously, everyone in the administration is so excited about and at the forefront. And so I was so excited, as it's always been of interest to me, that the EMS community was also thinking about this. And so as we went on this journey together and creating this 10-year strategic plan, what we're really looking at is first, defining equity. What does it mean? And yes, there's, the racial equity or outcome of patients equity or equity and accessibility to the EMS system, equity in the workforce, are communities of color being served by folks who look like them? And so I think, really that is such a huge step, because statewide, I will say, I think when you bring up the word equity in EMS, it means something a little bit different to everyone. And so I think the first big step for us is defining, and that's something we're going to focus heavily on in the next 18 months. And I think a key part of that is once you have this expansive definition, we want to be more inclusive than exclusive. We want to really have a broad definition, and then really creating a methodology that's very data-driven and quantitative to examine it. How are we doing statewide? How are we doing in our workforce and medical outcomes and, all of these things that we want to measure? And so I think for us, a lot of our equity work is really centered around what we heard people say statewide in the strategic plan. And so my hope is that when folks read it or see it, that they see a part of themselves in it, especially as we go to iterate on it every 2 years and really kick off this equity work here in 2024.
It sounds like folks are sort of really ready and hungry to start talking about equity concepts and to put pen to paper around it. And so how would you sort of characterize how ready the sort of EMS community, the workforce is to tackle some of these conversations and look at this and maybe do things differently than they did before, because we might be tracking things differently or looking at different outcomes? Or how ready do you think folks really are in California to do this?
I think we're ready, right? What I am hearing, and there are certainly EMS providers that are further along than EMSA in this work, which is so exciting. And I can't wait to bring them in and hear their lessons learned and how they're looking at the data and how they're, doing their analysis and their methodology, right? But I think folks are ready to have this conversation. I think it's remaining EMSA, making sure that we remain respectful of the data, that we are always putting it in context and perspective, and we're sharing it back, right? With the local communities, with the providers. I think making sure that we don't collect and collate all this information and then hold it within, that we are really the reconciler, the collator, that we're helping to write recommendations and we're sharing back. I think when folks feel like we'll do all this work and it'll go into a black hole and they'll never see it again, I think that's where maybe the work becomes irrelevant. So I think folks are ready for the conversation. I know it can be maybe a little scary at times, but I think there's not anyone out there that I've met that said, oh, we shouldn't be prioritizing this or it's not the right time. I think folks really feel like it is the right time, and we really have a lot of the cultural infrastructure, the data infrastructure, and we really have an opportunity in this moment in time.
I'm always curious. I have lots of thoughts and feelings about it too, but when you meet resistance to ideas and conversations you're having, how would you characterize what that resistance sounds like?
Look, I think resistance is natural because change can be very uncomfortable. Right. And I can speak to that even personally, right? Change is really hard sometimes. And so I think, folks might feel resistance for different reasons. Some folks are maybe concerned about what the data might tell about their local community if they know they might not have an equitable accessibility or equitable medical outcomes, or, they know that things may be not where they need to be. I think that regardless of what the fear is, I think, again, pulling people into this space and saying, that's okay. This isn't meant to be punitive. This isn't meant to be a moment where there's persecution. It's meant to be a growing and learning opportunity for all of us, right? I think if anyone was asked today, is the EMS system equitable in California? I don't think anyone could actually answer the question with data, right? And so we want to get to that place for informed policymaking, for informed decision making, for informed response. But in no way is that change meant to create persecution or punitive. It's meant to set benchmarks so we can help, so we can close the gaps that we see. So my hope is throughout this process of, regardless what that fear is, we're pulling people in, not pushing people away. I would love to know more too. Just, I think I know that you guys have been out there really collaborating with some folks who are maybe further along in this work. And have you been hearing some of that narrative, right, around fears and what that is that you hear? How do we learn from each other in this space?
Yeah, we've definitely, we try as much as possible to sort of get out there and spend time with folks who are working in the LEMSAs, working in community-based organizations that are advocating for change in their local communities. We spend a lot of time with researchers and who are doing EMS research-based work. I think some of what we hear, which I think is just such a natural reaction to what we sort of mentioned earlier about the systems in theory treat people equally, which, as we know, is a little bit different from equity. And so I think what we are still seeing and hearing a little bit of, even though we're seeing and hearing lots and lots of enthusiasm for looking at the work differently than before. So we're seeing a lot of enthusiasm for more data, disaggregated data, research studies that kind of show what's happening at a community-wide level or a county-wide level, and definitely at the statewide level. We're seeing all that, and that's fantastic. And then sometimes we also hear messages about, well, we treat everyone the same, right? That because we have practices and protocols in place, every encounter should meet that same standard. And that, I think, sometimes masks what might actually be happening and what the data show is also true, which is sometimes we don't treat everyone the same, and then sometimes we do, but it doesn't have the same outcome for different populations. And that's where I think the work really is.
Yeah, I think that's something we're really excited to look at too when we think through what data is needed and coming up with, once we have this definition, this comprehensive definition, what are the data elements that are needed to measure it or to set benchmarks? And I think EMSA really plays a key role in that, in setting those data standards statewide and making sure that, not only do we have compliance with the data standards and folks are reporting, but then it behooves us to not to use the data, to perform analysis and share it back out. I think as we move forward and advance this conversation in equity, I think what we will ultimately see, right, or what I hope that we see 15, 20 years from now, maybe when you and I are in these roles, is how did these initial questions, how did this initial plan, how did these initial analysis, knowing that there's going to absolutely be shortfalls in the data or gaps, how will it ultimately affect the Healthy Places Index? How will lifting up one part of a community that's maybe been overlooked lift up the whole community? And I think that is something we're excited to hopefully see throughout the years of this equity work that we're trying to kind of put together.
I have a question for you about how is EMSA thinking about workforce issues? Now, workforce issues, there's an equity lens there too. It's a part of it. It's that, the diversification of the workforce. How are you thinking about it and approaching it at this stage in your work?
Well, a couple things, I think. So, in terms of the workforce, I'd maybe separate it into a few different buckets. So, I think the first is maybe the most obvious. I don't know that for sure, but is really the diversity of the workforce. Can we look at, we have the central registry data system, and through that we have, all of the information on our EMS providers, and can we somehow collect race and ethnicity data through this licensing process and with our LIMSAs for EMTs, and really answer the simple question, are the providers who are serving the community, do they look like their community? Are they culturally competent? Do they understand? So I think that's kind of the first part of the conversation. I think the second part of the conversation, maybe the second bucket, is around training programs, right? How do training programs, or do training programs differ statewide based on where they're offered, how they're offered, who they're offered by? I think really, and that is a little bit more of a qualitative exam, less so than the first bucket, but really digging into those programs. And do some programs offer cultural competency modules while others don't? And I think third is really, and I don't know how we solve this, right? I want to be very transparent, but I think it's this moment of what, for those who call 911 and receive support from an EMS provider, what is their lived experience? It's difficult, right? 7 million plus transports a year, and even more touches every year than the 7 million folks who may not be transported, or interfacility transports, or a BLS response, whatever it may be. But I think, what is their lived experience, and how do we get that information back? How do we qualify it? How do we know what their experiences were if they were disabled, if their provider maybe didn't look like them or came from another community? How is that lived experience from our workforce professionals who are providing care? What does that feel like to them? And I think, again, I don't know how we get this information yet. I think it's all part of this process we're going to unroll together. But I think those are maybe the three buckets of how we think about workforce.
I love it. Yeah, I think that definitely mirrors how we think about it as well. I know here at the CareStar Foundation, we are doing some funding on programs. They're doing really specific and targeted outreach to communities that have been historically underrepresented in EMS roles. And so we're hoping that that does have an impact. And I would say, we can talk about this a lot more, but I think the value of our partnership, right? A specific partnership, not necessarily between Liz and Tanir, but a partnership between a statewide regulatory agency and a funding agency. I just think there's a lot that collectively we can do. So while we're funding some programs to help produce the new generation of wonderful and ready to roll, EMTs, and hopefully also paramedics, although we're starting mostly with EMTs. We could be doing that sort of on this side of the house, right? While you all are making space for larger scale conversations and drawing attention to what is the value to all of these organizations about more diversified workforces? What benefits is that going to bring to an entire community? And that's something that, quite frankly, we struggle with a little bit right now. We don't have great data on why it matters. What do the data show on why does it matter? What kind of a difference are you going to see if we have more harmony between the workforce that is responding to emergencies and the folks who are in crisis? We don't have a lot of data to show what the actual benefits are. What we know are community members who are saying sometimes language access is an issue. Sometimes cultural differences can get in the way of receiving the best care, or being heard or understood or seen in the way that they want to be heard and seen. But we definitely need more documentation and data so that together, you as the perfect amplifying body and us as sort of, writing the checks for the researchers to get out there and do the work, we could really work collaboratively on a lot of these issues, and workforce definitely one of them, because it's a big issue. It's going to take a long time.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a couple things to that. I think not only the partnership between you and I, which is, I think, so exciting, or between EMSA and the CARESTAR Foundation, but I think beyond that, it's then what new partnerships come from this, and what data do they have that we can integrate together and pull even more of the context into the conversation, knowing that we are, an entry point or a part of that healthcare continuum, but we are just one small piece. And folks may, depending on how this one small piece goes, could determine how the rest of that care goes. And so it's so critical. And I think for us, yes, we're looking at the workforce, but then I think it's everything you said beyond that. It's, okay, the workforce, what is equity in the workforce? What does it look like? What would the data show? Would it matter? Or why does it matter? What was the impact? And then going further, what about the medical or clinical care outcomes? And how do we partner with hospitals to do this larger analysis? And how does climate change or the behavioral health crises that we're seeing statewide? We touch 740 patients a day whose primary impression on their EPCR is behavioral health. And so if we are more informed in the workforce and we're looking at our clinical care outcomes and we're now cross-referencing it with the behavioral health crisis and how we treat those patients, right? Like, I think this then becomes this larger puzzle that all gets put together, that I think we're, excited to have those big global conversations and create the space.
That reminds me of another question that I'd love to just hear you talk a little bit about. I know that you and I are working together on our next round of funding, and one of the things that you want to do is bring in a DEI consultant. And tell me a little bit more about what your hopes and dreams and visions are for bringing that type of entity or person or group into. Like, what's your vision there?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. And we're so excited about this partnership. I think, very much so, being very much a realist or very pragmatic, we have these objectives that we want to achieve. And I think, but we are not the experts. We are not the experts in diversity and equity inclusion. And so having someone help advise us, how do we make sure if we go out and host these statewide listening sessions or ask for lived experience to help inform us, we want to do this in the most sensitive, culturally competent way. And so I think part of this, just at a very fundamental way, is just providing that expertise to EMSA to make sure, this is heard in a very sensitive way. I think overall, the vision, right, is we want to host kind of some major workshops all around the state that really start to look at and put pen to paper on our first two big objectives around equity. We want to really, before the end of the first quarter next year, have a, 95% definition of what equity is in California in the EMS system, in these different areas, in workforce, in medical outcomes, in looking at behavioral health. How do we define equity in EMS? And then I think with each one of those, what are the data sets that need to be pulled in to do this initial analysis of our system to get a baseline? And so I think the vision for this partnership is, bringing in the DEI consultant, sending out these kind of statewide invitations for listening sessions and feedback, not only from those with lived experience or advocacy groups that can help inform our decisions, but also from those closest to the work, the providers, the local EMS agencies, the medical directors, the hospitals, those who are really in that space every day working and closest to the work. I think this is our vision to really bring that work to fruition, really.
It's great. It sounds so exciting.
We're very excited.
I had another question just as we're sitting here talking. We're we're having a conversation about equity. You and I are both white women in the field and leaders of organizations. And what comes up for you around that? And what are some of your practices to kind of navigate talking about equity and working toward equity as a white person?
So thanks for asking that question. I think it's so relevant. And I think this is really gets to the answer just a moment ago. I don't have the lived experience, and I may not always be able to connect with folks that can, and so, or that do. And so I think it is so important for me to stand in my skin and recognize that I am a white woman in this role talking about equity and bringing in a subject matter expert that can help myself and our organization navigate these conversations in a way where not only is it sensitive and culturally competent, but it makes people feel safe to want to share, right? I think that is really a part of why we asked for the funding for a DEI expert to help us navigate those things. And for me, probably not to facilitate some of those meetings, right? I think the best thing sometimes we can do as leaders is take a step back and just listen. And I think that is really the lens that I want to move through this process with. So I think it's an excellent question. And I would love to know too, on your side, any tips, tricks, pointers that you have of how you navigate that?
Well, I think your answer was, pretty close to mine. I work hard to stay really, really humble, and to show up where I think it's important and where I need to be demonstrating leadership, and to take a huge step back and to not be in the spotlight or the spokesperson whenever it feels not okay. And to stay in beginner's mindset. I do a lot of reading, a lot of talking, a lot of listening. And I'm totally imperfect and will continue to be completely imperfect throughout the remainder of my professional career and life. It's something I do give a lot of thought to, and it's not always easy or comfortable. Like even, being a part of the interview today, I was like, oh no, she should talk to somebody else.
Yes.
And it's also okay to figure out where and how we can be in dialogue with one another and with the community about what we feel.
That's exactly right. I think that's exactly right. And I think too, because of where we're at, I also feel a personal sense of duty to it, even though I, like you, have that beginner's mindset, or maybe it's not always best for me to be in the spotlight in these areas or leading from the front. I do think though that, especially as a regulatory body, that we have a responsibility to have this conversation, regardless of, my gender or race. It's still my responsibility as the director to make sure that these conversations are happening statewide and to make sure we're moving policy in a way that benefits communities of color.
It's a really great segue to using the word policy. Tell me a little bit about sort of what you imagine good, exciting policy changes might be that you could see in the years to come.
I mean, that's such an exciting question for me. So I think a couple things, right? I want to be able to answer the basic questions. Does our current curriculum address what could be out there in terms of equity issues, right? Or things we might already know? Are we changing our regulations so that our training programs help to close these gaps, or EMS providers get more knowledge in a certain area to help close the gaps? When we get to analyze medical outcomes for patients statewide, if we see discrepancies by race or gender or whatever information may come out of that, how will then we, with our chief medical officer, say, we need to implement protocols that if someone is feeling chest pain, they will receive an EKG, right? Regardless of gender. Just simple things that if you know the gap exists, I, maybe naively hopeful, don't believe that anything can't be solved. But if you don't know the gap exists, you can't solve it. And so I think it'll be really exciting policy conversations in our clinical care standards and our training standards, and then really inform us when new legislation ideas come right onto the floor and we're having these conversations, looking at everything with that equity lens, or knowing that these gaps exist, ensuring that we are working with the legislature to make sure, even though something might be equitable or being done in an equitable way, this could have a perverse impact. And let's talk about that and how do we work through that. So I think that's what I hope for the future of behind this work, is that it really drives these other things to happen.
Much of our conversation has sort of hovered on workforce and implicit bias that may be manifesting in some of the ways that we greet people. And I sort of want to pivot to the more systemic inequities, right? That can by default manifest in different health outcomes. Particularly, one of the pressing things that's coming up for me at the moment is this idea that trauma centers in the state of California are not sort of beautifully, equitably, rationally distributed around the state in a way that it might take some people longer than others to, for example, get to a stroke or, a stroke center, or getting to a specialty center that they may require, and that we may see some differences. What could we potentially do together to deal with some of the more systemic differences? How resources are actually just divided around the state of California? What are your thoughts about that?
No, I think it's an excellent question. And I think infrastructure, right? This is such a key piece of everything right now that is being talked about in California, right? How do we, it's not, just trauma or STEMI or strokes, specialty care programs or centers. It's, it goes even more. Where are the behavioral health facilities? Where are the sobering centers? How are the urgent care clinics, distributed? And how do we get care to the patient, the right level of care at the right time in the right way? And so I think this is a part of the work. I think it's one of the pieces of equity that we absolutely want to analyze and look like. And I think defining with the statewide community, what is an acceptable transport time? What is an acceptable rate time? And does it vary by not only race and ethnicity, but does it vary by gender? Does it vary by age? Does it vary by disability? Does it vary by so many other factors? I think, or just so many factors. I think looking at all that is going to be a part of this statewide work. And I think it will go beyond just the trauma centers or STEMI stroke. I think it's, where is the healthcare infrastructure in California, and how does the EMS system, how accessible is it to the patients? So I think, just to go a little deeper down this rabbit hole, accessibility of the California EMS system, I think this is where partnership is so important. It's really kind of two prongs of this fork. Not only is it the EMS system, the providers, the ambulances, having access to the healthcare continuum. Do they have the right resources in their community? Do they have enough hospitals? Do they have enough infrastructure? But it's also, then do the patients have access to the ambulances? Are there excessive wait times? Are the patients being seen and heard for what they're experiencing in that moment? Is there implicit bias? Is there differences in medical treatment based on race, gender, ethnicity, whatever, disability, whatever that may be? And so I think this is all part of that larger conversation that we really want to look at in a comprehensive way. And it will be curious to me, as we go to write this definition, how this forms, because equity in EMS is so big, right? It's so complex, and there's so many pieces that need to be accounted for a comprehensive assessment, really.
That was a great response. And one of the things that sort of came up for me might be worth noting is that the CareStar Foundation has spent some time investing in and supporting a lot of work in local communities who are working towards standing up community-driven response models, right? So a lot of this work came out of the aftermath of George Floyd's death, and a lot of communities really rallied together to say, we want a different kind of first responder model. And many, many communities were saying, for example, one of the things that we'd like is we don't necessarily want law enforcement involved. We would love, however, to have more social workers and behavioral health respondents, and co-responder models are popping up all over the state of California. And at the CareStar Foundation, that's something that we're really enjoying watching, mostly because communities are speaking for themselves and demanding what they want. And I think particularly the need for more behavioral health support in a crisis is definitely feeling loud and clear. How are you all feeling about this sort of community-driven response models at EMSA, and what are your thoughts about where that journey may go?
Yeah, I think this is where, we're on the cusp of a major transformation here in California, right? And I know it'll be years in the making, but I think the way that we're thinking about this, and I would be remiss not to mention, right, is the work around 988 and how all of that integrates. And I think really where EMS is at from my vantage point is really figuring out where we fit, right, in this picture. If there's this larger community response and there's mobile crisis units and all of these things, how do we make sure that the right safeguards clinically are put in, where if someone is experiencing kind of imminent, maybe life-threatening issues, that although there may be a mobile crisis unit headed that way, that we also send an ambulance or something like that. But then also recognizing if we're not needed to, keep the ambulance or the first response where it is. And so, we're in the 988 discussions, which is just so exciting, right? That agency is writing the 5-year plan, and we're excited to be on that policy advisory group and really engaging with partners statewide to help inform it. And really, that is bringing in so many folks statewide and partners saying, this was my lived experience, this didn't work. We have this in X county and it worked so well. And so I think as we're navigating those conversations, saying, well, we'll raise our hand here, we think we could be really helpful, and then saying maybe we shouldn't be a part there. And I think it's just the humility of that natural conversation that helps us find our way. But frankly, I'm excited to see the future too. I wish I had kind of something that could show it to us, but I think we're just trying to take a bite out of that elephant, one bite at a time, because it is so big and we're really hearing from folks that they want that change. To just take it even one step further, I think I'll be very on the nose. We have got to do a better job in the EMS system of measuring clinical care outcomes. And I know that this relies on a deep partnership with our hospitals and the data that they have in their systems. But at the end of the day, clinically speaking, response time standards are not important except for high acuity, high risk calls. And we know that already clinically. And so I think it becomes so important to say, instead of measuring response time standards, because maybe it's easy, right? It's easy to just click these buttons and say, we got there, we were dispatched. Did the patient actually get the care that they needed, regardless of if it was a basic life support response, an advanced life support response, an interfacility transport, aircraft mutual aid? It doesn't matter the type of response or how fast you got there, minus this one small subset of, high risk, high acuity calls. But in general, what were the clinical outcomes of the patients that we served. And I think that is a much greater assessment of equity. And so it's encouraging to see communities who are going out for exclusive operations really starting to think about these things. So, Tanir, we've been talking this whole time and we've just kind of been touching the surface on data, but I want to just maybe go a little bit deeper there. I know we're thinking very deeply about data, how to use the data, how to make sure it's misinterpreted, provide context, but how are you all thinking about data, and what do you think the future of equity data and EMS looks like?
It's a great question, a big question. And in spite of the fact that I'm very aware that equity work isn't linear, I'm going to sound linear for just a moment, because the way that I think about the importance of data is it's like the fundamental starting point for any real change that you want to make. It's very difficult to change something that you don't fully understand. Not where you're at and not where you're going. If those two things aren't really clear, it's going to be really hard to make the change. And so data, just what we put into systems and what we can pull out of them, is so important to get to the next step in this journey of then, okay, knowing where we're at. How big is that problem? Is it a problem? I don't know. And if we were to call it not a problem anymore because, gee, we've solved it, what would that look like too? And in order to answer any of those questions, we need to have good data, clean data, consistent data across systems, across the state. All of the inputs need to be vetted, consistent, and monitored. And I know that is exactly, I'm speaking your language, singing your song, and talking about your journey. We know that's true. So from our side of the table as a funder, we're always thrilled when folks come to us with a deep understanding of and some humility around their own data practices, and just knowing that we could do better. We may not disaggregate. We may not collect everything we need to. We'd love to have more. So we love seeing projects like that. And, I'll turn it back to you, because when you talk about the whole data spectrum, we love, and that totally resonates with us too. Tell us a little bit about your data vision.
So we kind of have a big data vision here at EMSA. But like you said, it's very difficult to justify any progress forward in any area if you don't have this baseline assessment, maybe, or this baseline truth. I think the way that we say it here at EMSA is, what can you assume to be true? And right now, it's really difficult to make any true assumptions about equity in EMS because we don't maybe have all those pieces put together yet. But I think, we kind of have this tiered thought process around data. So we have the California EMS information system, and it's really collecting so much patient care data and what that looks like. And we have our central registry system that's collecting all the licensing information and, everything about our workforce. And then we have, we are standing up, right, the PULSE registry, physician order for life-sustaining treatment, and really respecting end-of-life care wishes and making sure that our providers have those in hand, or anyone who needs them has them in hand to respect those final wishes. And so I think it's first making sure, as you astutely said, clear, consistent data statewide, universally understood, really building, that's kind of our foundation, right? Is really building 100% compliance and a really strong data dictionaries around all of those, so we can perform these kind of apples to apples analysis that we need to do this baseline assessment. And then I think you have these kind of, the next tier is really then, how do you integrate that data? How can I have these golden records, or universally understood, where I can cross-reference data from the central registry with ChemSys and have an even more, right, complete picture of maybe what transpired at this larger level. And then I think it's, if this is our home, right, these three databases are our home, and we then are able to achieve integration, how do we get information from our neighbors, right? How do we get information from hospitals, trauma centers? How do we get information through the HIOs and make sure that now we've integrated and have a little bit more of a complete picture? And then ultimately, right? Ultimately, you want to get to a place that you can achieve predictive analytics. Ultimately, we are in a very reactive state right now. And so we are having to do a baseline assessment, create policy, and do all these things. But if you had this data integration, you could actually predict and say, we see that these 4 factors are occurring. If this ambulance service, who maybe is not, it's not fiscally sustainable or is being annexed or whatever it is, we now know that this is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 impacts. Now there's a change in a service delivery model. Let's wait and see what happens. And I think we want to move from a reactive to a proactive. And I think our local partners want that too. And the data is the key to those building blocks to get to predictive analytics, where you can predict the future of that community in a finite way, or at least be able to acknowledge there is a 60% risk of X occurring if this hospital shuts down, whatever the metric may be. And I think that's the state we want to be in. And so, I think this is really, and a lot of that has to do with equity and accessibility. If you can do these predictive analytics, you can close gaps before they even tear open. So it's a big data vision, and I humbly recognize that. And it's a lot of work to get there, but I don't think there's anything more worth it if you can close a gap before it even opens.